second last question. I think grade inflation gone wild by, I don't know, somebody's gamer tag. About 6 years ago, I was sitting in the student union of a small liberal arts college when I saw a graph on the cover of the student newspaper showed the history of grades given at that institution in the past 30 years. Grades were up, way up. I am a scientist by training and I love numbers. So I guess this is an article written by somebody. I'm a scientist by training and I love numbers. So when I looked at that graph, I wondered how many colleges and universities have data like this that I could find. The answer is that a lot of schools have data like this hidden somewhere. Back then, I found more than 80 colleges and universities with data on grades, mostly by poking around the web. And I created a website, gradeinflation.com, so that others could find this data. I learned that grades started to shoot up nationwide in the 60s, leveled off in the 70s, and then started rising again in the 80s. What is this? Not secure. Cool. Thank you, mysterious author. It's beautiful. I created a website to find this data. Then the grades started to shoot up nationwide in the 60s, leveled off in the 70s, then started rising again in the 80s. He doesn't have data prior to the 80s here. It looks like it's a pretty linear relationship over time, in that average GPA is increasing by about half a GPA point every 5 years or so. Nonetheless, what about today? Grades continue to go up regardless of the quality of education. At a time when many are raising questions about the quality of U.S. higher education, the average GPA at public schools is 3, with many flagship state schools having average GPAs higher than 3.2. At a private college, the average is now 3.3. At some schools, even 3.6. At elite Brown University, 2/3 of all letter grades given are now A's. Changes in grading have had a profound influence on college life and learning. Students walk into a classroom knowing that they can go through the motions and get a B+ or better. That's what they tend to do, give minimal effort. Our college classrooms are filled with students who do not prepare for class. Many studies less than 10 hours a week. That's less than half the hours they spent studying 40 years ago. Paradoxically, students are spending more and more money on an education that seems to deliver less and less content. With so few hours filled with learning, boredom sets in and students have to find something to pass the time. Instead of learning, they drink. This sounds like some huge generalizations and shots being thrown at the younger generation. But anyways, a recent survey of more than 30,000 first-year students across the country showed that nearly half are spending more hours drinking than they were studying. If we continue along this path, we'll end up with a generation of poorly educated college graduates who have used their 4 years principally to develop an addiction to alcohol. There are also studies out there, I might add, that show that millennials, I don't know about Gen Z, but millennials binge drink less than the baby boomer generation, that they do less drugs than the baby boomer generation, but I digress. Many say that grade inflation is a complicated issue with no easy fix, but there are solutions. About the same time that I started to collect data on rising grades, Princeton University began to do something about its grade inflation problem. Its guidelines have the effect of now limiting A's on average to 35% of students in the class. Those guidelines have worked. Grades are going back down at Princeton, and academic rigor is making a comeback. A similar successful effort has taken place at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, and through a concerted effort on the part of faculty and leadership, grades at Reed College in Oregon have stayed essentially constant for 20 years. Princeton, Wellesley, and Reed provide evidence that the effort to keep grade inflation in check is not impossible. This effort takes two major steps. First, school officials must admit that there's a problem, then they must implement policies or guidelines that truly restore excellence. I asked Dean Nancy Malkiel at Princeton why so few schools seem to be following Princeton's lead. It's hard work, she answered, because you have to persuade the faculty that it's important to do the work. Making a switch will take hard work, but the effort is worthwhile. The alternative is a student body that barely studies and drinks out of boredom. That's not acceptable. College and universities must roll up their sleeves, bring down inflated grades, and encourage real learning. It's not an impossible task. There are successful examples that can be followed. I am looking forward to the day when we can return to being proud of the education that our nation's colleges and universities provide. Analyze sTUarTrojsTaCzer's argument in Great Inflation Gone Wild, addressing the following questions. What evidence does he use to indicate that there's a problem? How would you characterize this evidence, for example, scientific or anecdotal? And to what extent are you persuaded by the evidence he provides to suggest that grade inflation has a profound effect on life and learning? To what extent does he persuade you that a change in policy is necessary or that such a change would make a difference? Old man yells at cloud. That's what I got out of that. sTUart has tried to establish a causal relationship between inflated grades and efforts made in studies, and research finds that there is a negative relationship. These are higher grades with ease cause students to make less effort, thus the remaining time spent by students drinking and other leisurely activities. To make a generation of young with poor educational understanding, thus it is the effect of inflated grades as a problem that is overseen by sTUart. 2, our Janine Tutor said that evidence given by sTUart is empirical evidence. It's collected the past data and observed and analyzed the classroom atmosphere of today, such as levels of students' homework, preparation, and criticism of U.S. higher education. Recent studies of students have also supported the issues raised by sTUart. Up to a certain extent, sTUart is persuaded, but he is not fully persuaded. It's because he has not put the light on the mechanism of grading of students. The change in the mechanism and application of more balanced, categorical approach will improve the grade. Thus, light on these aspects is not put in the given case. Also, colleges and universities, as well as students, focus on employability skills rather than grades. Employability skills land you a job, but grades can only give you a ticket for an interview. Lastly, sTUart is persuaded to revise the grading system as there is no harm in it. Regularly, it is also required, but the focus should be on building employability skills. Presence and access of a lot of data, tools meant to prepare better, students of today, better equipped for their studies in comparison to students of the 60s and 70s. My take on this article was that he seemed to make a lot of generalizations and assumptions without linking specific studies. Also, having been taught some studies in undergrad about things like the amount that students drink compared to our peers of past, this seems to go against what I've read. Lastly, sTUart should take a lesson in website design. Last question, I think, or I might be done.